Okay. All right. Can you hear me? Yes. All right. So, thank you very much for coming back from the coffee break. I'd like those of you that are to take their seats, of course, so that we can start on time. We have lots to say also in this panel. So welcome back to Power from Statistics, delivering the evidence of tomorrow. This panel has a very ambitious title, I would say. It's Depicting Globalization. It's something that actually maybe fortune teller might have issues in dealing with nowadays. We're going to be discussing several interesting topics, globalization or maybe globalizations, different ways and different approaches to a quite large phenomenon. We're going to be touching upon concepts of winners and losers. Who is winning out of a certain type of model of globalization? We're going to be mentioning the facts that globalization has. Simply put, factories that close, factories that open, new business opportunities, fourth industrial revolution, impact on communities, social impact. We heard this morning very interesting thoughts on how Europe sees the social component that has to be somehow safeguarded or protected or reconfigured depending on the context. We're going to be also talking about business ecosystems, the role of SMEs, of multinational enterprises. Are we facing something new? Has it happened before in the history? Is this new the fourth industrial revolution, something completely new? And for all these topics, we have three eminent panelists with us today. And they are Ronald Jansen, who is Assistant Director for the United Nations Statistics Division. He's coming from New York, so thanks for flying to us. And he's leading the area of international trade and economic globalization statistics, and deals with a set of topics that he will be indicating, of course, during his interventions. Then we have Sturgeon, who is a senior researcher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And, well, he focuses mainly on the process of global integration, emphasis of onshoring and outsourcing practices in the electronics, automotive, and service industries. And finally, we have Christoph Weiss, who is an economist. He's joining us from the European Investment Bank. And he will be giving us a little bit more the financial perspective also of those topics and how, like the finance and banking system is playing or can play or a specific role into that as well. My name is Tomas Matraia. I'm a moderator of this event and executive director of the Node, which is a multidisciplinary platform that works on sustainable development goals. And today also I'll have the pleasure to get the insights of the panelists. Let's start maybe on a topic that has been brought up yesterday, which is the topic of how one could communicate better or more effectively statistics in the realm of globalization. Because what happens sometimes, I would say, is that lots of people talk about globalization, not necessarily we have the whole same understanding of globalization. So data, information, knowledge could help us here in finding a common ground on that. But there are also cases and situations where data maybe is not effectively communicated. So I would like to hear maybe from Tim in this case, if he could have some examples of from the industries of this type of potentials that we have not tapped.
Okay, sure. I think that we thought we understood globalization, and in the past few years, since 2011, we've seen collapse in international trade. So a huge trade slowdown, and we don't really fully understand why. So leading up to that, we can look at waves of globalization in the past, moving from trade in commodities to the the spread of multinational firms for market-seeking behavior to, in the 1990s, the growth of what we call global value chains, so the fragmentation of industries and companies across geography. So particularly with the famous iPhone case, where you have the phone designed in Cupertino and manufactured in China. So what you see there on a micro scale is a global value chain that fragments the innovation part from the production part. Okay, so then we have, to supply that phone, we have knowledge-intensive inputs from, panels, screens, originally hard drives, but then memory chips, all kinds of other high-value chips coming from Europe, from Korea, from Japan, into China for final assembly. So this created a revolution in measuring globalization, because prior, in the good old days, it was Chinese companies producing, or U.S. companies in the U.S. producing products for export with intermediate inputs coming from the local society. Here we have inputs coming from all over the world. So the factory gate price of that iPhone of, say, $300, well, the value actually added in China was only about $6. But in the trade manifest, on the export manifest, that factory gate price was recorded. So that really was exaggerating the exports from China by 2,000+%. So this created a revolution in kind of measuring international trade to try to take into account the import content of exports. So instead of just the gross exports, it would be the kind of net trade. So the statistical community and the research community responded very quickly by setting up, making estimates by combining input-output tables with international trade to create the trade and value-added data set that can estimate this. So here's an example of a big change and a response by the statistical community to provide some needed answers. But today we have this trade slowdown. So then the question is, well, maybe these intermediate inputs are being produced in China now instead of being imported. And maybe that's why things are slowing down. Or maybe it's just the fact that Europe is slow to recover from the global financial crisis, and so the demand for is low. So we don't know. But what the bigger point is, we depict these global value chains very well. We have new data to describe this, and then suddenly the world changes, and we have to then react. So I think the bigger point is, for economic statistics, is to go from being reactive to proactive. We've already talked about that yesterday. That seems like a great idea, but I think that's not enough. I think being proactive sounds nice, but I think there's more of a need to be adaptive. So to be able to quickly react to new trends and create new tools and systems, which is a lot to ask for data agencies and national statistical offices that are, well, historically been more slow-moving. Let's put it that way.
Ronald, would you like to pick up on that?
Thanks, Thomas. Good morning. I'd just like to add on a particular point here on this effective communication. So there is, in headline news on trade, a lot to do the last year also on this bilateral trade deficits between U.S. and others, particular U.S., Mexico, U.S., China. And there was an article this past summer in a paper called America's Quarterly, or a journal, which went into the fact like Ford was trying to actually set up a new plant for Ford Focus, a big plant, and what the difference would be if it would actually, that plant would be set up in Mexico or the plant would be set up in China. And they indicated specifically also on the U.S. supplying components to that assembly plant. And if this plant, under current NAFTA regulations, would be in Mexico, about 40% of U.S. parts would be part of that car, Whereas if it would go to China, that would be only about 4% because there would be a lot of local suppliers to the plant. So coming back to the point Tim already made is that this content, in this case then, the foreign content of vehicles exported from from Mexico to the US might have a lot of US content in there. So that I think that article very nicely articulated this issue, that there is a lot behind just talking about a big trade deficit between US and Mexico. For instance, in this car, in the automobile industry, there's actually a lot of US parts in the final assembly of the car. So with winners and losers, so if there is a new plant in Mexico, might not be in the US, but the supplies from US, US components into that vehicle still gives employment in the US. So I hope that was clear.
Quite interesting. Christoph, would you like also to share your thoughts on that? Yeah, should be working.
Yeah, on communicating globalization, probably not directly related to what my colleagues just said. I think there is a tendency more and more to talk about winners and losers. Traditionally, when we were talking about trade, we were looking at country aggregate statistics, and now with the emergence of increasingly using more firm-level data, we can talk about heterogeneity, about difference, and really identify the losers and the winners. And traditionally, trade was very much about manufacturing and building things and the intermediate inputs that went into the car were also physical objects, and increasingly we know that cars are most of the value comes from software, and those are new trends that are increasingly more difficult to capture, for instance, and that's not directly related to trade statistics, but for instance at the EIB we have recently developed a firm-level data where we try to understand what are the investment priorities of EU firms, and we also have questions about whether they export their goods or services. From the survey that we have, almost half of the firms in Europe directly export their goods or services. We have questions about also where there are subsidiaries, so the increasing importance of looking at the statistics of the group as opposed to the individual firms that consist of those groups. And we also have questions on whether they invested in other countries, and we only at the second wave, so we not really have a long history to provide the historical dimension, but we see this increasing importance of looking at a transnational operation, while national statistical institutes have to respond to policymakers who are very much interested in their own country, and that raises challenges, basically, of why you need to report and how this information can be useful for the national policymakers.
Thanks. This leads me a little bit to the second part that is more specifically tuned in relation to two important actors. From one side, the multinational enterprises, and from the other, the small and medium enterprises. Now, there are different dynamics that could take place, of course, in the future. They're already taking place, that could position the role and the capacity to perform of those two actors in different ways. We could perhaps imagine a world where multinational enterprises are getting even more power. This had historically happened. We were exchanging before with the panelists, for instance, on the example on the East India Company that was historical. It is a historical example of a multinational that actually was even capable to forge its own coin. So this just to show and present not only the capacity to have control on a territory on behalf of a kingdom, but it is, I think, a relevant example of the power and the capacity multinational enterprises have. I don't know if giants like Google, Walmart, or Apple might be comparable, not of course but who knows, someone is already coining its own currency. So we might see, for instance, elements that bring us to a specific role of multinational enterprises that could even become stronger. And we need to see how we can cooperate or engage them in also getting and receiving data. In which way we can do this? In a collaborative way, in a co-shared modality, and sharing responsibilities. And on the other hand, we can see also a future where we can have, maybe thanks to the fourth industrial revolution and lots of technology that can be available, we can have SMEs that can play a bigger role, more dynamic. Now, we have those two elements that can, of course, be assembled in different ways depending on what will happen in the future. But I would like to listen from Ronald, in this case, how he sees the capacity or the possibility or the opportunity, or maybe a social commitment that could be very effective in having multinational enterprises providing this data to the statistical community.
Thank you, Thomas. Let me start by just stressing the important roles of multinationals in this globalization and global value chains. So given that important role of multinationals, we like to, from the statistical community, get more information about multinationals to understand their business strategies, their business dynamics, their global strategies, and so forth, and to do that in a fairly timely manner. So within the statistical community, one thing we stress as important for building up the statistical data infrastructure is last case units at the National Statistical Institutes. So last case units and quite a number of, especially in Europe, quite a number of European agencies have that installed. So last case unit looks at those multinationals in their territories and has dedicated staff talking to those multinationals to obtain direct information and consolidated information, which is also important for the large company. That they don't have to report 10 times, but that they would be able to report through one unit on all important aspects. So the global value chains are very much driven by multinationals. We need to understand them. What's more difficult for a national office is to get the global structure of the company. So there in Europe, we've got the Europe Groups Register, which is very well developed already on how the enterprise groups are working. Given the fact that what they put together in that repository is not only head offices in Europe, but also if there is an affiliate in Europe with a head office elsewhere, they also try to put that in there. An issue with that is still that it's very difficult to release data out of that database, out of this EGR. Because of confidentiality issues, you can't really indicate where Apple is located and where Apple has all its offices, because that's under the confidentiality rules as we discussed earlier today. So one of the things looking forward, which I would really like, and now you're talking about how to directly engage with multinational enterprises, is to see at an international level if we can directly get data on their structure. So data which is relatively not sensitive, talk directly to big companies to compile global enterprise structures and make that available to well, for us it's to the statistical community, but to the public in general. Other things here which are maybe on your wish list. Well, one thing is we like profiling, so multinational companies don't do just one economic activity, they might do many, and you want to know about that. Supply chains. This is more under this corporate social responsibility. Companies do report already under different on different fora, different podium. So they report, for instance, to the UN Global Compact on these corporate social responsibility. There is also, it was mentioned yesterday by Enrico Giovannini, there is this global reporting initiative under which companies also like to report their corporate social responsibility because they like to contribute to these sustainable development goals reporting. So that's where some of the companies like to, for their own branding, like to provide information and transparency. So there are a number of additional kind of information which is being made available. I think I'll stop here.
Thanks.
Yeah, very briefly again, and to come back on the issue of the structure of those groups. I think one good example of where we can slightly better understand how our international group operate is in the case of commercial banks. If you think, for instance, of how commercial banks are expanding through Africa, one big issue that is discussed at the moment is the emergence of Pan-African groups. And banks are supervised by their national authorities, but what you see increasingly from central banks is that they need to take into account also the operation of the banks in other countries because of the risk that could create for the home country, especially if those banks are systemic. And increasingly, because of this supervision need of the national authorities, there are better understanding of also how they operate in other countries. Of course, for non-financial operation, there might not necessarily be a need to be so detailed about the activities. It mainly comes more from a tax perspective rather than the risk that they could create for the local economy. But maybe there are lessons to understand how increasingly, for instance, how central banks cooperate to gather better information of how the groups operate.
Thanks. Tim.
Yeah, just on the topic of multinationals, the only thing I'd like to add in is the idea that I think we think of multinationals as Ford and Renault and Apple, and these are branded companies, and we use their phones and drive their cars. But what we've also seen, part of this globalization process in the 90s that I mentioned earlier was the globalization of the supply base. So big suppliers now are multinationals. So when we talk about multinationals, we're talking about several tiers of production: services, finance, intermediate inputs. These are all multinationals. So the role, what you see is is a mirror of society. You have the globally connected and the globally operating, and the people who fly in airplanes all the time, and folks that are not connected, and SMEs that are not connected, that are outside of that orbit. So it's a very stark bifurcation, and it's important because multinationals the idea was you can get a multinational to come to your country, and that would create a lot of spillovers for employment and for local companies to supply. And now the suppliers are also global, so it squeezes out the space for participation. And in a case that Ronald mentioned with Ford Focus, it might seem like a big blow to the suppliers that Ford has decided, well, we're going to make this car in China and not in Mexico. But it's the same suppliers making parts for Ford in China and in NAFTA context. So I think that there's a lot of subtleties. The international business registers are critical to be able to answer these types of questions in a nuanced and rapid way. I would say that Eurostat and Europe in general is ahead of everybody else. By necessity, Europe has had to create international data sets, and so they're kind of way ahead. What I would just encourage, and I think what Ronald's been a leader in this, in kind of pushing those boundaries out to the global level. But if multinationals are reporting their structure at the global level, what we really need is a global business register. So we can't stop at the European borders. And I think there's a tendency, because it's hard work even inside of Europe to get this done, that there's a kind of, I feel a sigh of relief with the new framework for modernizing the business statistics coming into force in Europe, we say, we've gotten our pieces in with the business register, with the microdata linking, but I think it's unfortunately, I think now what Europe and Eurostat should do is provide that example and that leadership role that we can't just leave it to the UN, which has vision, which has connections, but doesn't have the resources to really kind of drive those data sets out to the global level. Because otherwise, we still can't answer questions. Because China is, for example, is an increasingly important part of the global economy.
Ronald, I think that you might want to say something on that. Yes, diplomatically, of course.
There is, let me emphasize, there's a lot of cooperation within the statistical community. So both between national levels at a supranational Eurostat level, where there are other international organizations like OECD and others who are working in this field. And together, I think we can do a lot of things. There is within the work that is ongoing on globalization nowadays, on this measurement, we're working a lot on the micro level data. We partner with academia and research, which have like firm level case studies, which are important to actually feed into this domain. We have business statistics from the various national statistical offices gathered by Eurostat and others, but also at national level, where the microdata linking takes place. But we also work with the macro national accounts people nowadays. There is a lot more in this area, a lot more cooperation between national accounts and business statisticians, and that's really necessary to have the micro level and the macro together to get this overview about who's contributing to what within globalization. And the additional complication is that you have to go across your border. So you have to share and cooperate with other countries, with your main economic partners. I mean, I'm talking from the national perspective. You have to work with your main economic partners to understand how your industries are interconnected with other industries and where your opportunities, challenges, and vulnerabilities are.
I think that we heard some very interesting words also in relation to the role of Europe, as you could be a perfect advocate for that team. So I think that is it the same when it comes, for instance, to the role of SMEs? Do you share the same approach, or because of the very nature of the business, is it the same? Of course, Christoph, if you want to add on that as well.
So yeah, very quickly, and to make the link between SME and the need to modernize business statistics, I'm going to refer again to this Eab Investment Survey, which is a corporate survey, some 12,000 non-financial corporations, and we're in the second wave. And when we look at the investment activities of this firm, of course, the vast majority of the investment goes into fixed tangible assets. So firms invest a lot in land, in machinery and equipment. But I mean, something that we did, and we use, in that sense, we went slightly beyond national accounts because of the increasing importance of intangible assets, is that we ask more questions on the different categories of intangible assets. So we ask them whether they invest in R&D, whether they invest in software and databases, but we also ask them whether they invest in firm training or in organizational capital. And one point that I would like to point out, of course, I mean, manufacturing firms invest much more in R&D than firms in services or construction, but services company, and increasingly service company become more important for global value chains and for international trade, invest much more in software and databases, and those are things that are slightly more difficult to capture. And to make the link with SME, what we found in the survey is actually that, of course, SME in absolute value, they invest less than a large corporation, but they tend to invest much more in intangible, and they tend to be much more in the service sector and in those new business models that are sometimes a bit difficult to capture with the current business statistics that we are familiar with. So there is really a need to go more into developing statistics that correspond to the business model of those small firms.
Gentlemen, who would like to pick up on that?
In relation to small medium enterprises, I think one thing which I think is a development over the last 5-10 years, maybe longer, is the increasing maybe sophistication of business registers and associated data at the country level, and then trying to connect business registers between countries if possible at the European level. But business registers are a backbone to economic statistics. If you have a good business registers with snapshots every so often, you see business demography and business dynamics. And I think that's the key for knowing what happens with young firms, what happens with small and medium enterprises, what kind of economic activities they're involved with, if they survive or not survive, and why would they survive, and all of these kinds of dynamics at the micro level of business registers is something which is very interesting. And it's, it was also mentioned earlier, is that access is being given to those microdata by two researchers who are interested, if it is in the US or if it is in Europe, in various country levels. But that's where you would see how the performance of SMEs is, and how and what the dynamics and let's say evolution is on these issues.
Just to quickly, just to reflect back on the question of data security that we talked about in the previous session, it just strikes me that these microdata, these confidential microdata, I haven't seen one leak, data dump, WikiLeaks, anything, and that could either reflect the great security at Eurostat and other data agencies, and the way they protect confidentiality, or it could just be that the data is not very interesting, and people would much rather read emails, diplomatic cables of people, talking behind each other's back. So I don't, or financial data or credit card information for individuals. So I don't really know. In terms of SMEs, I've already said that we see, as in society, a bifurcation between the globally connected and the locally isolated. I do think that there's obviously many exceptions to this, and we can talk a little bit more about the opportunities for innovation that are coming through these new digital platforms. But I do think it's important to come back to this idea, because reflecting on the communication of statistics and of globalization, these supply chains are complicated. The stakeholders have particular interests. The big companies, they operate in multiple geographies and jurisdictions, and so it can quickly become difficult for people to understand how things really work. So if you ask the average person about their iPhone, they say, oh, well, it's made in China by kids. And then that makes them feel bad. But then they realize, well, it's Apple's American company. Okay, they just thought to forget it. Let's check my news feed. So there's a kind of, in that kind of vacuum of real information, the political opportunism to kind of beat up on China, on Mexico, as kind of doing this or that, when it's actually a global value chain that's delivering these products. I think it's a real problem. And I also think that the bifurcation I talked about, and the kind of the uneven impacts that you mentioned with these kind of, if we can have data on the kind of micro impacts of globalization in terms of geography and communities, then we can understand perhaps better why so many people feel alienated by globalization, and the people that are kind of in that club, resulting in some very disturbing political outcomes in the last 18 months.
Well, one could argue that maybe also with statistics and data, one could make globalization maybe not human or too human, but closer to humans somehow, no? To explain the dynamics, especially at the local level. I would like now to, before open the floor for a first round of questions for our panelists here, to remind everyone that you can, of course, tweet through the hashtag #PowerFromStatistics. And I would like now to open also the possibility for the participants here and for those that are following us through the web streaming to answer, to give us their thoughts on the question, which is how shall statistical offices improve data on multinational enterprises, so that we can also have a pulse of what is what you think and what other people are thinking in relation to that. You have to refresh on your application the question here, the part, the button with the question, to make sure that you are actually responding to the right question. I think that the colleagues have already opened the voting. So now I would like to turn to the public here, in case someone might have questions or would like to. Please, there is a lady over there. Thank you very much.
So I have to stand up. Okay, you're right, because I'm small. Even when I stand up, people may not see me. Martin Durand from the OECD. Of course, we're part of this great work that's done internationally on trade in value added. And I'm not going to ask a question neither to Ronald or to Tim, because they work with my teams at the OECD. But my question is broader. If we want really to, and coming back to the people, because that's what the question you asked, and if we want to get into this debate about why is there this backlash against globalization, I mean, that we've seen in the US but elsewhere. I mean, a lot of people think that they're losing their jobs, that globalization is not benefiting all, and trade may not have benefited people. There are lots of losers. So I think we need to be clear that perhaps, I mean, TIVA certainly, I mean, trade in value added and other work will answer this type of questions only if we are able, so I would go even further into the linking of the data, into linking with jobs. Where are the jobs created, and for which people are the jobs destructed, I mean, in some countries, and in which country, and at which level, in which region? Because until you have really dug into this issue about who is affected, who are the winners, who are the losers, of course we need the basic, you know, the business registers, we need to understand better global value chains, but that means as well that we have to integrate foreign direct investment with trade as well, see whether multinationals, what do they do with their profit that they make in the countries where they have invested, do their profits stick in the, I mean, do they invest, in, do they, the money they make in the country, does the money stick in the country? Do they reinvest in the country? Do they repatriate their profits? And then where do they pay their taxes? So this whole globalization story is very complex. And that will require much more effort to actually be able to link very many different data sets, jobs, very detailed jobs, regional aspects, FDI and trade, profits and FDI and so on. So I just want to send, in a sense, I think what we've been doing is very good, but if we really want to address this issue about, you know, how do we go about responding to the backlash against globalization, what else is needed?
Thank you. Who would like to take that? Who's brave enough?
Well, no, I think that's really fantastic, and I think you've, in terms of what else needs to be done, you just gave us a fantastic list. So we have to understand where the production, consumption, trade flows, connections to jobs, but also where the money goes. So following the money is, so, you know, where is the meat in the Dutch sandwich, you know? And so there's a lot of gaming going on, and taking advantage of these kind of jurisdictional disharmonies and incentives and other things. And I think what really what alienates people the most is they feel like they're not part of it, that it's not fair. And you see that in the statistics on income inequality. So I think that globalization is only part of it, but there's this kind of black box of what's going on, but I know that I'm not winning. I'm not kind of winning as much as some folks. So I think following the money is really the ultimate. So first we have to, it's kind of building up these, the data sets to include the money. But when you get to the money, that's where you're I think, I mean, it's one thing to combine IO data sets with international trade, you know, but when you start following the money, you'll have a lot of pushback. And I think that Europe, again, is taking the lead from a political perspective in regard to making sure that companies are more transparent and pay their fair share of taxes in their appropriate jurisdiction.
There's willingness to answer as first, right?
Oh, no, I mean, I think Martin indicated all of the questions that are difficult to answer, but very pertinent to the whole issue on globalization. Yes, jobs is something that definitely is something that should be on the foreground of the kind of measurement proposals we are coming up with, and the kind of analysis that will be done, and it is being done. But the thing is then also that in globalization we might have to want to look at the whole production network. If there are so there will be in winners and losers. Maybe there are losers at certain parts of the U.S. and winners in other parts of the world, right? So, but that's within a production network where the multinationals still might be gaining. So the whole issue is complex. And I just wanted to give two particular case studies from the developing country perspective, if you like. So in the automotive sector, we've been looking at Morocco, where there was a recent a lot of investment by France from Renault and Peugeot is coming there. They invest mostly on the assembly plant side, which is another issue, which is automation. There's a lot of robots being used currently, especially in the automotive sector. So the employment actually for Morocco is not that great on those assembly plants. So what's the incentive? Now, traditionally, Morocco does a lot of wire harnessing, which is part of this automotive sector, which is employment intensive. And they actually went up over the last 5-10 years. I don't know if it's directly related to the French investment, but in general, in the increase of the automotive sector, they went up from 75,000 employees for that particular area to 150,000. So that's where Morocco had a big gain, being part of that value chain of automotive. Very shortly, a last one. Costa Rica is a very particular case in the electronics global value chain, and that was and it's a public secret. Intel was heavily invested in Costa Rica, producing computer chips. They were doing finalization of these chips, testing, and then they would be exported. So exports in computer chips of Costa Rica was very large up to 2014, when that particular activity was moved to Vietnam. So all of a sudden it looked like that the exports of Costa Rica collapsed. But actually the electronics sector did not collapse in Costa Rica. Why? Because services were left behind, were still active in Costa Rica. Services on R&D, on accounting, other kinds of services from Intel were still left there, which actually for Costa Rica meant a difference. I mean, they lost some employees, not too many, and average salaries for those went up because this is the kind of upgrading in the chain. So there is a lot of story behind globalization, which is not directly obvious from like trade statistics, merchandise trades. Hopefully you would see something in trade and services, but that's much more difficult to follow. But you have to see the full picture to understand what's happening.
Christoph.
Yeah, very quickly to respond on jobs and the number of jobs and how we characterize a company in business register. I think we know a lot about what are the fixed assets of the company they need it when they, for instance, want to access bank finance, etc. We know very little about jobs. Basically, at best, we know the number of jobs. Maybe we have the total wage bill, and then we can count with globalization how many jobs were lost and how many jobs were won in another trading partner. But we have really difficulties of understanding also the quality of jobs, the skills contents of those companies. And again, coming back to this film, we were not very good at trying to characterize this important component of the company. So the skill content of the company, you can compute maybe the average wage bill that would the average wage that is paid, but there would be of course a very poor proxy of the quality of the workers, and that's something, especially with the emerging of multinational service company where skills are key. This is something that a lot of work needs to be done to better understand how those firms create value through the skills of their employees.
There is a gentleman here. I would like to keep on having some questions, if you don't mind, before showing the results that I know we already have. But before showing, I sense that there is growing interest, so I would like to have this. Yes, and then, of course, the professor.
I must stand up, but I'm so tall.
But the camera should be able also to picture you.
My name is Walter Rademacher at La Sapienza University. Well, I think we have not really touched the most difficult point that we could see last year in the so-called the famous Irish case. Tim has mentioned, or Roland, the services part. So as soon we enter the world of services, things become, let's say, much more complicated, because you can transfer intangible assets within a minute to another country, because the tax conditions are better there. And this has really had a huge impact on the Irish GDP last year, which was discussed up and down. So I think we have a multiplication of difficulties as soon as these things happen in a more service-oriented, let's say, sector. Now, my first question is, do we communicate in a sufficiently good way? Because we are talking about TIVA, GDP. We have said now that we want to take into account the labor market. But for all of these issues, we might need different sets of macroeconomic indicators. And this might confuse the public because we are giving the impression that the GDP is of lousy quality. We might, even if we try to avoid this. But isn't there a communication issue? Second question is, do we have sufficient standardization between the macro and the micro level? Because at macroeconomic level, we have the national accounts principles and handbooks, which are not perfectly mirrored at micro level. And I think there we have a job to do in really closing that gap between macro and micro analysis.
Thanks. I would like to, before giving for a quick round of replies from your side, also mention the fact, to bridge the two questions, the previous one from the colleague of the OECD, that there might be the need to have a way to communicate in relation to technical data for the policymakers, for the institutes, but we might want to consider also how to communicate to the general public, to the audience, in order at least to prepare what's going to happen. What's going to happen in the future, for a simple reason, because and this will lead us to the next question in relation to the disruptive, the evolutionary technology that we will have. So I think there is a social, there's an important social point in terms of preparing, informing, and then by using data to show where the jobs go, in which way also communities and societies can be better prepared. At least I think it's a moral obligation and a social obligation of the legislators, of the governments, to inform also on that. So it might have different techniques, but I think that the aim is the same in communicating and raising awareness on that. If you would like to have a reply on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, of course, and very well formulated by Walter. There's obviously no easy answer to it. I think it's, to your point, yes, communication means communication also to the wider public. And the Irish case brought out that communication needs to be done, and communication will not be easy. Even at a technical level, it's very difficult already to explain what exactly happened and why, how you can defend, which they could very well in Ireland, defend why this change in GDP took place, why there was this, what they call a level change. They don't expect any change like that over the next few years. They will just be at that level. That's what they expect. But it's a communication issue about what happened and what is behind the data. I actually want to link the two comments that you made. I think in communicating we need to have the micro and macro level shown together. So you would have to indicate what's happening at a more detailed level, and then shown what that means global. I mean, in the overall macro economic analysis of the national economy. In addition, because this is globalization, you might have to expand to that even beyond your own borders, and to see how this fits with other economies. Which brings me also to the point that if we want to explain very well also TIVA and other issues, we need to work on the micro level, because current concepts and definitions of micro business statistics and trade statistics may need to change so that we have a more harmonized data between countries. I think over the years we have not paid as a statistical community enough attention to the fact that the concepts are not really symmetrical, which means that we can't really link very easily data from one country with the other, and I think that's something we need to work on. And once we fix that, I think it's also easier to communicate the globalization aspects, because it will have to do with a number of economies. It's not only Ireland. They will have to, if we really want to explain it, it's also what's being happening with Ireland, US, and maybe China, to understand the full picture.
Tim?
Again, yeah, I agree. Those are really great observations that Walter made. I think that we're using old language to describe, to try to describe new things, and I just don't think it works. I think that the GDP is still a real thing, but layered on top of that are these global flows. And there's always been kind of arm's length trade, but we have something different now, which is coordinated, orchestrated, inside of multinationals, but also in supply chains, systems that span industries and countries. So, maybe there's a measurement for the domestic economy, and then if you can break out and analyze differently the global economy. I mean, I'm just kind of brainstorming here completely, where you talk about a different set of indicators. And that way you can kind of get away from this fiction that, we have this enclosed domestic economy that, again, really leads to political results of people who just don't feel it. They don't feel like they're part of the economy, because they're not. They're part of their local economy, but not the domestic economy. So maybe that's what's needed.
So yeah, very briefly to react on the link between the macro and the micro. So as economists, we always think that GDP is the most important acronym, and the international organizations are very good at creating acronyms. One thing that one should also focus on, I think that was really a red line throughout the entire conference, and I'm probably going to state the obvious, but one question is how to communicate better on the DGP, on the data generating process, and how basically those measures are constructed. Of course, we don't want a TV presenter to become like pharmaceutical commercial, where you have a footnote that takes half of the screen explaining how the data was measured. But I think it is increasingly important to explain better how the data is generated. For instance, with journalists yesterday were telling us that they go to official statistics because they are the truth, and we know that they're not the truth. That the best estimate that we have, given the way we measure it. So I think when it comes from power, from statistics, it's not only about the quality of the data, but how you communicate it effectively and educate people to better understand where the data come from, and then they will also be able to assess why you have those rapid changes, for instance, in an important measure like the GDP of Ireland.
All right. There was the professor. I'd like to take the last question before showing the results. Yes, the gentleman over there, the professor, please.
Hi. This might be this is a peasant question from somebody that does not understand the area. If we think about three different economic systems from sort of first world, second world, third world, we're trying to impose a common set of indicators, which are clearly first world indicators. Are they really giving us a handle on second world economics, that's to say managed economies like China, and third world economics, which is developing countries? So is it reasonable, is it sensible to look for a single set of indicators, or should we be thinking about different ways to describe second world and third world economies and economic development?
Thank you very much. I would like to bet, please, Christoph.
So I'm probably not going to address your question, but for instance, if you look at R&D investment...
I wanted to bet on that. That was quite high.
If you look at the R&D investment, and if you look at the fraction that is done by the public sector as opposed to the private sector, then you would think that, for instance, in the EU, about 65% is done by business R&D, while if you go to China, or it would be more than 80%, and then you would think that the business are much more important for innovation in those countries. But it turns out that many corporations are actually owned by the government. And so, again, you have the issue of how you measure and important issue like even ownership of the companies.
Oh.
I'd like to come in because for the United Nations, we really like to look at indicators which are very useful for all members, especially also on the developing side. Yes, I think in the ways of finding new indicators for globalization, there's a lot being developed under the G20, and they have their own G20 perspective. I can see that. What we are doing and hopefully be useful for all economies. So on the one hand, we're working on this trade in value added. What's the value added? Which is done on one hand a lot invested by OECD, WTO on that, which might be a little bit more towards the fairly advanced countries. We're also working on this global value chain perspective, where we also would like to have a model which can be used in developing countries. I mentioned Costa Rica and Morocco. There are others where we concentrate on industries which are important for that economy. Most developing economies don't have very many industrial sectors which are doing well. So you can concentrate on that and see what are the main partners and build up enough data within that group. For instance, for Morocco, we want to have cooperation with France, Germany, Spain, and Romania for the automotive sector, because those are their main partners, especially France, of course. And then to see if we can get indicators which are useful for national policies going forward. And that can be also in textiles in Bangladesh. It could be in agri-food and in some of the East African countries where we are looking at. So there are possibilities, I think, which also benefits developing countries in this context.
Very briefly.
Just very quickly, yeah. I just really think that kind of regional drill down and these kind of looking more closely at particular industries and in groups of important trading partners, it's really exciting work. It gives you a kind of a zoom-in snapshot of what's going on. But I would like to answer your question. No, I don't think that we need different concepts or terms for first, second, and third world. The point really, I think that all of us are making is that you have increased global integration. So that's exactly the opposite direction that we need to go. Global integration is pushing statistical integration. And, that's the problem that we're grappling with here.
Thanks a lot. Okay, I think that if the colleagues there are able to put the results on the screen in relation to the first question that we asked. All right, so how shall statistical offices improve data on multinational enterprises? 9% share more and better integrate existing data. 40% offer incentives for multinational enterprises to provide data. 37% collect data at European level. 14% other. So I think it's quite well distributed. And we have also a tweet that is confidentiality an obstacle to improve global business register. Thank you very much. That was an acronym that was not clear to me. An obstacle to improve global business register or in using big data to collect missing information. Now, I think that this has been touched partially before, so we'll not get into that, as long as you're not super fast on that, if you want.
I can be very fast on
Please.
that. So I think the European Groups Register, which has information about enterprise groups, as I mentioned, is a great resource of information. But there is a real difficulty of sharing this. And that's because it has been put together by national officers under confidentiality rules, and they stick with those confidentiality rules. So yes, it is an issue. I know there is work being done, and I really hope that solutions can be found, that information can be used out of this European Group Register. First of all, of course, to your own national, the ESS, the European Statistical System, but hopefully also more broadly, because I think it has a wealth of information in there which we like to use, and hopefully we can also use it in building a global business register.
Thank you very much. All right. Let's go now to the following part, which is about the new digital economy. We've already touched upon that. There is a whole new world that is coming up. I think the team has lots to offer us and to present us. But this is something that, more and more, one of the talks that I have with friends, colleagues, in terms of, like the risks or the advantage of this new digital economy is like, there is a group, I think maybe a generation that is not considering now getting even the chance to one day retire as maybe a result of optimization of what might be called the knowledge nomads generation, like people that might have valuable skills that would need to reconfigure and readapt their capacity and their skills through different type of organizational patterns. They might need to learn and unlearn quickly and readapt and be able to move. And this might be a consequence maybe of the digital revolution that is happening. So this has, of course, also quite strong impacts on our society, and I think also our forma mentis, our mindset in how, like we consider certain jobs. So I would like to have Tim giving us, an overall understanding, because he wrote on that, and his article is available online as well, his contribution to the Outlook report, if he could share his thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, we're hearing with increasing frequency and urgency daily in the newspaper about the coming fourth industrial revolution, the new digital economy. And we have to ask ourselves, what's new? Is there anything new? Is this all hype? What is the digital economy? So there are 5 elements. There's the factory of the future, the advanced manufacturing, automation, robots, sensor-laden systems, not only on the factory floor, but throughout the supply chain. Then you have the data from new sources of data, including the factory, but also all of our mobile phones and just the kind of the data flowing into the system. The system that's flowing into is the third element, which is the cloud. So the ability to aggregate data remotely into pools of data. Number 4 would be the analysis of that data through data science and big data analytics. So in other words, to make sense of phenomena through huge pools of data that were not available before. And then number 5, the thing we hear about the most, which is artificial intelligence, which is to take those insights through the analysis of big data and then make decisions and have the system actually improve itself over time through machine learning and et cetera. So that's the whole world of the new digital economy. For economic statistics, I can just say that all of the problems and the challenges that we've talked about are multiplied, because all of those flows are services that come up in economic statistics as services. The services categories are already kind of out of date and not keeping up, and now we have a new wave of products, services, and processes and flows that leave the statistical system even further behind. So I'm sorry to be negative in that sense, but it is a very dynamic process for jobs and society. We really don't know, but what we do know is that the stakes are extremely high. We were talking about automation. People have huge numbers for the number of displaced workers, not only in the factory floor, but in offices as well through the automation of knowledge work. If we look to the past, we see that this kind of computerization of work, we've already seen it between, and I described it earlier, the separation of innovation from production. So you're able to kind of physically separate these two things. So you have designed in Cupertino, manufactured in Silicon Valley. What you see with the digital economy is the penetration of that type of modularity of work, fragmentation, the ability to kind of pull things apart but still leave them interconnected, moving into in greater and greater swaths of knowledge work. So if you have artificial intelligence to produce multiple designs for your new product, you can design one operator of the software can design very quickly without and things are automatically validated and tested online. So the engineer becomes one engineer instead of a team of engineers. So the story would be, just before I stop, the team of engineers would create one product. They test it. Well, it's not quite right. Let's do another one. By the fifth product, they're like, well, it's good enough. Let's send it out. The artificial intelligence feature built into some of the new design software could come up with hundreds or thousands of designs that all fit the criteria and can be tested for supply chain availability, for operational manufacturability, et cetera. So the designer becomes the one designer instead of 20 designer and testers, can be more of an artist to say, well, that one looks the coolest. So that, as opposed to having the technical skill of the heavy lifting in engineering and programming. So that is a depending who you talk to and where you sit, that's either incredibly frightening or incredibly exciting, or both. But I think, when you think about those kinds of changes, it's really a question of, rapidity, how fast these changes will happen. And if things happen very quickly, you can have shocks and displacement. If they happen slowly, you have adaptation and a lot of people being able to kind of move into different areas, but not everybody. So you still have this question of people who are left outside of the system, and that just kind of multiplies over time.
Do you think we have the tools to capture such a fluid and volatile environment? Is an ever-changing environment in some cases? Do you think, the statistical approach so far, the methodology, do we really have the tools that can capture this, or we should rethink or reconsider that?
Well, the elephant in every room is that when you talk about economic statistics, it's services. Is that we don't really have services data, so we end up kind of endlessly looking at the flows of goods. We have good statistics on that, and I really don't see. I see, well, from my colleagues who are working hard to improve services statistics, I bow to them, and they're doing good work. But I don't see really any kind of organization, statistical agency, really taking the bull by the horns and trying to require more reporting. You know, the services statistics through EBOPS is collected mainly through central banks. So I don't know if our central bankers are still here, but why? It does not seem to be an appropriate role for the central bank to produce trade statistics. I mean, so I'll just say it.
Ronald, you want to pick up on that, maybe?
Yeah. This is, as Tim indicated, a very broad area, and I will only focus on one aspect, which has been discussed also lately, which is on e-commerce. Mm. And I do think that in e-commerce we will have a chance to get new ways of actually collecting data. And the example I have is I recently was in China. We work closely with China Customs. We have some other regional statistical officers also talking about basically about merchandise trade. But Chinese Customs is also very much interested in e-commerce of cross-border parcel trade. And what they've done there in China, and I think that is something that is in some way or another also replicated in other countries, they try to make an integrated platform through which information flows for this e-commerce. So there are businesses would log on to an online platform. There would be a payment system integrated. There would be a distribution system integrated. And also for things that go cross-border, there would be a customs system integrated in that platform as well. So all the information entered by customers, so part of this is business to customer trade. There could also be business to business on it. But all of the information put in by the customer, the client, would be captured, and if it would be cross-border, it would immediately release a customs form with all the necessary information, and that would be filed and go through. So this was a necessity in a sense for China Customs, but it does show, because all of that information is electronically available, so you have to just set it up in such a way that you could, from a statistical agency's point of view, also collect the necessary data. So China Customs is actually the statistical agency in China collecting trade. So they managed to do this in that way. And I think this kind of platforms is one way of capturing digital trade. And this not necessarily has to be parcel packages being sent. This could also be the streaming of music or streaming of that somehow you would be able to capture that as well. Might also include, or necessarily include, good agreements with the provider of that kind of service.
Do you think this model would work in Europe, out of your experience?
So I'm going to take a total detour. And coming back to what was said at the beginning about the consequences of the digitalization for the labor market, if you look at European workers, for instance, there is a database developed by university which is called SHARE. It's a survey on health, aging, and retirement in Europe. So it is a survey mainly people who are age 50 or above. You look at how many jobs they had during their life, and typically in Southern Europe, they had, on average, the majority had only one job. Some had slightly more jobs, especially in Northern Europe, maybe 3 or 4. With this increasing importance of services and workers less linked to companies or moving much more often, and with skills that become obsolete much more rapidly, you would think that firm training will become increasingly important for those companies, and especially in innovative companies, firm training. And again, in the Eab Investment Survey, we looked at around 10% of total investment is dedicated to firm training, so not a lot. And here I would not have any statistical evidence, but anecdotally, I believe that usually when the firms train, they usually train their high-skilled workers. They spend much more money on training their high-skilled workers rather than the low skills. And those low-skilled workers are those who are going to suffer the most from this rapid revolution from the digital revolution. And this calls, of course, for developing better measures of capturing first indicators on how much firms spend on training their workers and what workers they train, because to also capture who will suffer from this rapid increase in digital commerce.
Thank you. And we're just going to briefly launch the final questions for the vote, which is what are the priorities for improving globalization statistics? And we're going to be closing this in 2 minutes because it's time, of course, to have to go for lunch. But I would like just to take one final question to pose to our panelists, should this be the case, if someone might have a burning question or the need for food is more relevant at this juncture. Okay. Just for you to know, when we are going to be back, we will be having the keynote of Dr. Kult, that is here in the first seat. She will be telling us about the limitations and the potentials of foresight. I think it's a very interesting topic that, of course, connects to this fluid reality that we are experiencing. And I would like to thank the panelists for their greatly appreciated contributions and the diversity, of course, of angles that have been offered. And with this, I would like to see whether we might have also still maybe some seconds for the final results of the voting. And I guess that we are close to that. Final suspense. Okay, so the priorities for improving globalization statistics. 19% improve statistics on MNEs, 11% improve statistics on SMEs, 48%, the winner, improved measurements of global value chains. I think that someone made the point here. So congratulations. In an equitable way, of course, inclusive. And finally,